Good afternoon. On behalf of State Superintendent Joy Hoffmeister and the Oklahoma State Department of Education, my name is Tom Kirk, and this is the Title III English Learner and Immigrant Overview of Program Requirements for this school year, for the 2020-2021 school year. So we have several things to talk about here. This is a general overview, so we've got kind of a long list of topics. We do have another webinar scheduled for this afternoon after this one, where we will look a little more closely at the identification process and at the English Language Academic Plan. But today we're going to have a broad overview of the basic requirements, both in terms of your requirements for teaching English learners, and then more specifically about Title III and the two parts of Title III, the EL and the immigrant part. We will go briefly over the process for identifying English learners. And then we'll talk a moment about bilingual status, which is actually not under federal programs, that's a state status, and kind of the difference between and how you arrive at bilingual and English learner status. I would also like to look at the criteria for immigrant status, for Title III immigrant. And then we'll have a brief look at the ELAP, or the English Language Academic Plan, as well as the LIEP, or the Language Instruction Education Program that's embedded in your consolidated application. And then we'll go over a few points that you need to be aware of in the application before going over a general discussion of allowable and non-allowable expenses under Title III. And then we'll end up with a little graphic called Who Do You Call? Because there are several people working on English language acquisition, and we're each kind of pigeonholed. So we'll look at who's doing what and who you would call with various questions. Okay, so first of all, basic requirements. You're required to identify and assess English language learners in a timely fashion. Okay, this is not a Title III requirement, even though at the top of the page it says Title III. That's a basic civil rights requirement, actually. So you're required to identify and assess English language learners. You're required to have a research-based language program, and this is what's expressed in the LIEP. You're also required to have staff who are sufficiently trained to meet student needs, and that includes the needs of your English learners. You have to provide equal opportunity for students to meaningfully participate in all school activities without unnecessary segregation. So that's clearly your English learners should not be segregated if at all possible. And you're also required to address the language needs of English learners that are also classified under Project 504 or the IDEA, individuals with disabilities. More requirements, it's kind of a long list. You not only have to address the needs of the English learners that you have identified and who you're serving, but you still have to address the needs of English learners who opt out of services. That's kind of a tricky one, which we'll come back to in a little bit. But just because the parents of one of your English learning students opt out of services, they're only opting out of supplemental services. You still need to require, or you're still required to address the needs of that student. You also have to monitor the progress of English learners, both the ones who are still in your English language program, but also those who have exited services for 3 years after they've exited services, just to make sure they're continuing to progress. And you should regularly evaluate the effectiveness of your language program, and you're required to provide meaningful communication with the parents of English learners. So with that kind of summary of all of the requirements, let's move into the first topic area, which is English learner identification. So the process here begins with the home language survey, but it does not end with the home language survey. The answers on the home language survey do not in themselves determine EL or English learner status. What they do is they indicate which students have to be screened for EL status, and you use the WIDA assessment, the WIDA screener for that. And it's only the WIDA screener, this screening test, that determines EL status. So the home language survey will flag which students you have to test, and then it's the test result that determines who is classified as an English learner and who is not. Okay, bilingual status too stems, or the process of identifying bilingual students starts with the same home language survey. And here I have a screenshot of the current home language survey. I'm not sure if I just don't have the right glasses for the focal length or if the screenshot's not all that sharp. But this is what it looks like. It's available on our website. I've got the address up here in a minute. So for bilingual students, okay, here, let me back up a second. There are a series of questions on the home language survey, these numbered questions 1 through 6. And the first 3 of these regard language. And if a student responds with a language, if the answer to the question is a language other than English on 2 or more of those 3 questions, then the student is called a more often and automatically qualifies as bilingual on the accreditation report. So 3 language questions, if 2 or more are something other than English, then that student is considered bilingual. If the student answers a language other than English only once out of the 3 questions, then the student is considered less often and might qualify for bilingual funding or qualify as bilingual. So for a less often student to qualify as bilingual, they also have to meet one of 3 criteria. So they have to have answered a language other than English once on the home language survey and have a WIDA assessment score that says that they're an English learner. Or if they scored basic or below basic on the previous year's state testing in the English language arts assessment, and they have one language other than English, or one answer that's a language other than English, then they would qualify as bilingual. Or letter C here, if they have one answer that's a language other than English and a score at or below the 35th percentile composite reading score from the spring of the previous school year on a state-approved norm reference test. Okay. If you fail to provide appropriate documentation for bilingual funding, you may be required to reimburse previously distributed funds. Okay, the next category of students, immigrant students. For the purposes of the Title III immigrant program, immigrant students are defined as those who meet the following 3 criteria. First of all, the student is between the ages of 3 and 21. The student was born outside of the 50 United States, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico, and the student has not been enrolled in a U.S. school for more than 3 years. And I added this slide to today's presentation because we have discovered a number of discrepancies between information provided in the WAVE about students and the numbers of students who are identified as immigrants, that there seem to be a lot of students who either should be identified as immigrant and aren't being identified, or perhaps that are being identified and should not. So for the purpose of Title III, these are the 3 criteria for defining who is an immigrant student. And this can lead to some unlikely immigrants. For example, there are a number of children who are born to servicemen who are born overseas and come back and enroll in a US school for the first time. Okay, those, for the purposes of immigrant status, those kids are considered immigrants. They were born outside of the 50 United States, and it's probably the first time in a US school. I bring this up because my own kids would fell years ago into this category. They were born overseas, and when we moved back, they enrolled in a US school for the first time. So for 3 years, they were considered immigrants. Moving on then to our next topic, the English Language Academic Plan, or the ELAP. So this is the next step in the process. You start with the home language survey. If a student has an answer to any of the questions that's a language other than English, then that flags them to be screened with the WIDA screener to identify them or not as EL. You check to see about the bilingual status as well. When you get the results of the screener test, those students who are not proficient are identified as English learners. And then for each student, you complete an English language academic plan, or an ELAP. So once they've been identified and tested, you create an ELAP for each student. And I have here, I just have the first and last page of this in this presentation. There are 4 pages overall, but we see each section, I hope, is pretty straightforward. The first section is demographic information, and then there's an area where you can enter the scores from placement testing, which placement test you used and what the scores are. There's an area to put in the OSTP scores. And if it's a student is continuing in the program, then you'll have the WIDA access score from the previous year. And then at the bottom of the page here, section 5, it has English language development goals. So you determine, there's a whole process for determining what the goals are, but it's basically linked to what are called the WIDA can-do standards. So you set out the goals and compile this. Then there are sections for accommodations to be made in the classroom, accommodations in testing, and so on. And then the final page, you have the signature page. They have signatures of people involved in creating the ELAP, as well as the supervisor, site administrator. And then at the bottom, there is a parental opt-out box. Okay. In the past, there's been some question as to whether all parents have to sign the ELAP. And the current position is parents have to sign only if they opt out. So if a parent wants their child to opt out of English language services, they have to sign the ELAP, and you have to have a signed copy on hand for your records. The thing is, the opt-out is only opting out of supplemental services. You cannot opt out of EL status. Once the child has been identified as EL through a screener test, the only way out of that status is to progress out of it and to test proficient. So there's been some confusion. Parents think that they can change their students or their child's status, or for some reason, feel like there might be some stigma and they want to erase that. That's not the case. They're only opting out of supplemental services. So a few things about the ELAP. The ELAP is in many ways parallel to an IEP and should be developed by certified staff. It outlines basic student demographic information, testing data, goals, and accommodations for both testing and learning. And the ELAP will follow a student in a specific year, but they should be updated every year based on new testing data. So each year you'll have testing data for the WIDA access test, and in almost every, say in all normal years, you'll have data for OSTP. So the ELAP will have to be updated on a yearly basis. And this is not optional. You're required to have an ELAP for every identified English learner. So completion is mandatory. And that is something that we often check during the monitoring process. We might ask for sample documentation or just ask to see some and walk through them to make sure they're compiled correctly. Another question that pops up often is whether you have to use the same form that we've developed, and you don't. Districts are allowed to use electronic resources to create ELAPs. There are some vendors out there who do this. That's fine, as long as you have all of the required information. All that information is recorded. And I would like to add that it's recorded in a way that you can retrieve that information for an individual student. It is also mandatory that parents be notified of the completion of an ELAP. So districts are expected to make a reasonable effort to ensure that parents understand their children's educational status. That often means reaching out to parents in a language that they understand. Parents, as I mentioned above, have the right to opt out of supplemental services, although that does not change the student's EL status, nor does it exempt the district from facilitating and encouraging student learning. So even if the parents opt out of supplemental services, you are still required to meet the needs of that English learning student. You just, it kind of makes it a little more difficult because you cannot use supplemental services. Okay, the next topic here then is the LIEP, or the Language Instruction Educational Program. Okay, this is generally an overview of what it says, of how you go about teaching English to English learners. So it should cover how the LEA intends to meet the federal requirements that we mentioned above for addressing the needs of English language learners. And a lot of the information in the LIEP tab of your application, the Title I application, deals with civil rights obligations, but there's also, there are a number of boxes where you can outline your educational program. And here I'll just throw out there two basic types of program for English language instruction. There are either bilingual programs and English as a second language programs. Okay, bilingual programs are less common. This would be a program where instruction takes place in two languages. We prefer for these to be of limited duration, but some students need this in order to get their language up to a point where they can then participate in a mainstream classroom. So you have a bilingual program where teachers and students will speak the two languages, and that should be limited to get kids up to speed. Much more common are ESL programs, or English as a second language program, where all instruction is in English, with a focus both on proficiency and content. And this would include mainstream courses with some extra structuring in order to address the needs of your English learners. It could also take the form of tutoring with English-only instruction aimed at both improving language and also addressing some content concerns. And that brings us to then the application. So here, this is the consolidated application that's on single sign-on. Within that consolidated application, okay, all districts that reported English learning students in the previous year's October counts are required to complete the LIEP tab on the Title I application. So if you have even one EL, you have to lay out the program. How are you going to address the needs of that student? And that's in a tab in the Title I application, the LIEP tab. Okay, this should align in broad terms with Program Details tab of the Title III application if you receive a Title III allocation. Not all districts who have ELs will get a Title III allocation. That doesn't let them off the hook for the LIEP. You know, if you have any ELs, you have to fill out the LIEP tab. If you have enough ELs to generate a Title III application, then you'll also fill in the Program Details tab in the Title III application, and that should align. It should align with what you have in your LIEP. So I mentioned not everybody gets a Title III allocation. In order for a district to receive Title III funds, you have to have enough English learners to generate an allocation of $10,000. And unfortunately, I can't give you a specific number of how many that is because it does shift according to the federal formula. It does shift a little bit from year to year, but you need to have enough to generate $10,000 before you get anything. So it's either kind of 10,000 plus or bust, but you know, you're not necessarily out in the cold if you don't have that many. Districts can join together to form a consortium, combining their counts in order to reach that $10,000 allocation threshold. And then each consortium designates a lead LEA that will receive and manage the allocation and spend the funds across the member districts. Okay, clearly that happens with consultation of all of the member districts. It's, you know, everything's decided collegially, but you designate one LEA that will handle the finances. Okay, a couple more things regarding applications. Districts and consortia receiving Title III funds are required to address all three of the following areas. And this is explicitly laid out in ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act. You have to address program improvement and professional development and parent-family engagement. Another thing that means is that since all districts receiving Title III funds are required to use some of their allocation on professional development, that means all districts with a Title III allocation have to complete the professional development worksheet under the Program Detail tab. A little bit more about applications. This is a general rule that we find across federal programs. Just as Title I funds are supplemental to state and local funds, Title III funds are supplemental to Title I funds. So just as Title I funds cannot be used to supplant state and local funds, Title III funds cannot supplant Title I funds. So in other words, they cannot be used to provide services to ELs that are provided to other students with Title I funds. So in general, Title III funds are to be spent on your English learners, but your English learners, before they're English learners, they are your ordinary students. They might also be Title I students. So you, first of all, have to treat them just like all of your other students. If they're also Title I targeted students, you have to treat them like all of your other Title I targeted students. And then after you've done that, you can provide services with Title III funds. So that's the thinking behind some of the allowable or non-allowable expenses, which we're going to look at in a minute, some of which are not immediately obvious, but we'll get into why there are some of the restrictions in place that there are. So We'll start with some allowable things. If you receive a Title III allocation, you can use up to 2% of that on administrative costs. So some examples of acceptable, allowable administrative costs: you can pay a program director or a coordinator's salary, or a portion of it. You can pay an assistant to the program director. You can pay a data entry clerk for Title III. Although, if you have a big enough EL population that you need a data entry clerk to work just with Title III. You can buy supplies associated with running the program, such as ink cartridges and paper. You can pay for postage for mailings that are specific to Title III. So all of these things are allowable as long as they are working exclusively with your Title III students, the English learners or immigrant students. Technology. This is a big topic these days. Technology can be purchased with Title III funds. There's a caveat though. That's as long as that same technology is not being provided to non-EL students with other state and or federal funds. We consider technology a way to upgrade your program, so that's fine. I've received several communications from people lately where districts are scrambling to get a hold of all the devices that they can, and perhaps they had purchased devices for the Title III students, or they're buying devices for all of their students, but they want to use Title III money to buy them for their ELs. You can't do that. If you're buying, say, Chromebooks for all of your students across the board, you have to buy them for your ELs as well. That's the part of the supplement, not supplant thing. So you can purchase technology as long as that technology is specific to the needs of your EL population and is for their use only. Okay, then we start getting into some of the negative things. Title III funds cannot be used to administer the state English language proficiency assessments, the WIDA tests, because that's mandated. You have a requirement to identify all of your English learners before Title III kicks in. That's part of, that's considered a state level activity. So you cannot use those funds for the language proficiency assessments. Perhaps a little counterintuitively, you cannot use Title III funds for ESL teachers. And that's because you're required by law to meet the needs of your English learners, even without a Title III allocation. So that is, that's considered an obligation, not a supplemental service. So we don't pay for ESL teachers. What you can spend the money on, though, some personnel, you can spend Title III funds on tutors that work directly with EL students as a supplemental service. You can use Title III funds to pay the salaries of bilingual or ESL paraprofessionals that would work directly with ELs, like all paraprofessionals, under the direction of a certified teacher. You can also pay the salaries of ESL instructional coaches, whose role is to acquire scientific-based research practices, provide professional development, and mentor and coach teachers who are working directly with English learners. Okay, this does not necessarily mean working with only ESL teachers, but also with mainstream teachers who have English learners in their classrooms. Another item that comes up pretty regularly is that of translations. And again, this is kind of tricky. Since LEAs and schools are required by federal law to provide meaningful access to information and services provided to the parents and guardians of all of their students, including EL students, for many communications, Title III money cannot be used for translations. So Title III Part A funds may only be used for supplemental translation and interpretation activities that are not provided by the LEA for all students. And they can be used for translation activities related specifically to Title III Part A. So it's not a hard no on translations or interpretations, but only for Title III specific communication, because for general communications, you're required to make that information accessible to the parents, so that is not considered supplemental. Okay, I've got some examples here because these are questions that come up really all the time. So let's, imagine you have a welcome center at the beginning of the year for administering the home language survey to everyone. Okay, you cannot use Title III funds to pay the salaries of the staff doing that, because you're required to give the home language survey to all students. If the LEA has a contract with a translation company that provides translated notices for federal programs, then only the portion of that contract that pertains to Title III notices may be paid for with Title III funds. So if there are a number of notices that pertain only to Title I, you cannot use Title III funds for that. But you can use Title III funds for translations of Title III notices. If the LEA or school communicates on a weekly basis with all parents about school activities, it would not be appropriate to use Title III funds to pay for translation or interpretation of these documents or activities, as the LEA and the school are obligated to provide meaningful access to information and services provided. So Title III funds could only be used to pay for supplemental translation or interpretation. So that is only for documents that are targeting specifically your Title III students. Okay, let's look at then the other side of Title III, which is the immigrant, not just Title III EL, but also Title III immigrant. In general, Title III immigrant funds are to be used for activities that enhance instructional opportunities for immigrant children and youth. And some examples are family literacy, parent and family outreach, training activities designed to help parents become active participants in the education of their children, recruitment of personnel who've been specifically trained to provide services to immigrant children and youth, as well as tutoring, mentoring, academic or career counseling for immigrant children and youth. More about Title III immigrant expenses: identification, development, and acquisition of curricular materials, software, etc., to be used in the program carried out with awarded funds. Those are allowable. You can also pay for instructional services designed to assist immigrant youth, such as programs introducing them to the educational system, civics education, and so forth. And it's also allowable to use Title III immigrant funds on activities coordinated with community-based organizations, institutions of higher ed, private sector entities, other entities with expertise in working with immigrants, to assist parents and families of immigrant children and youth by offering comprehensive community services. Okay, we're nearing the end of the presentation. I wanted to show here before I move on to questions, because I see there are several here in the chat box. There is this flyer that we had made up showing the people working with English language proficiency, and who's in which office. So we have a list of kind of question areas and who you would contact about questions in each specific area. I'm going to hold this up here because my next slide is just one that says questions. So I'll go back and leave this up for a little while and look at the chat box and see what. Okay, we'll start off with, when do you expect this slideshow to be posted to the OSDE website, certainly by the end of the week, probably within a day or two. Let's see, is immigrant being run completely in the wave? Every year I run an ad hoc on our student system to double check students who may meet the criteria. I love you. I'm glad you do that. No, it's not run entirely in the wave, and I spent a lot of my summer trying to reconcile the data from the wave with other data. So no, it's not run completely from the wave. A lot of you probably received a spreadsheet from me with potential students who had been mislabeled. I hope that in the future we'll get a more accurate way of counting and accurate and user-friendly way of counting. Okay, is there an effective way to search a student's enrollment past? We're relying only on self-reporting from the families. You know, I'm not really up to speed on the IT side of things. I believe you can check in the wave to some extent, but for out-of-state enrollment, you might not get very comprehensive data. Okay, there's also a comment here from Dan Rule, the Executive Director of English Language Proficiency, specifying bilingual qualification may look a little different this year if your district is serving ELs in a distance learning program. Additional guidance is available in the English Learner Return to Learn document, and there's a link to this on the web. You can find a lot of useful information from that office on the OSDE website. Just search English Language Proficiency. They have a very informative page, including the English Learner Return to Learn document. Okay, if our parent opt-out is on the parent notification and score report letter, does it have to be on the ELAP? It has to be either on the ELAP or connected to the ELAP. You know, when you retrieve them, you have to, it has to be clear that the parent knows what they're opting out of. So preferably on the ELAP, or yeah, if you include all of that on a single document, that would be okay, but I would like to see the signature on the ELAP itself. If a student was identified in another state and we have WELPA scores from 3 years ago, but now their HLS doesn't indicate any language other than English, do we still have to screen them? I would say yes, because that student has been identified in another state. This is an issue that we will address in the home language survey webinar later in the day. Often for one reason or another, parents will change the answers on the home language survey. So if you have evidence that that student was identified as an English learner in another state, then yes, you do at the very least need to screen them. Are EL directors required to recertify yearly? I honestly don't know that. I don't believe so. But if you send me an email, I can check up on that. Okay, yes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and put up the questions slide here and leave this up for another minute or two in case any more questions come in. Okay, here's one more. If a student was enrolled for the first time in a US school in January, does the 3-year count for immigrant status start from the calendar year or the school year? It begins with when they first enroll, so beginning with January. Okay, I'll go ahead and put my contact information up here. We are currently working from the office only 2 or 3 days a week, so I may not answer that phone number. I do get voicemails that arrive, they come to my email, so if you do leave a voicemail, I will get back to you. The email address, of course, is good. And I would like to also remind everyone that in a little less than an hour at 2:30, we have yet another webinar focusing more specifically on the home language survey and the English language academic plan. And there's one last question here saying, when will this be posted? I hope it will be posted within a day or two, certainly by the end of the week at the latest. And with that, I'm going to sign off, and I think I'll probably see a lot of you in a little less than an hour.